Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Van Maren, and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. One of the things I've wanted to take a closer look at for quite a while is what's going on at the United Nations in regards to the abortion issue, in regards to the issues of life and family that are so essential to the flourishing of society. Because most people don't really pay attention to what's going on at the international level in regards to these issues. Most people don't realize that decisions are made by people they've never heard of in conversations that they're not party to, and often at events that are never reported on. In fact, language about abortion inserted into international agreements, for example, can actually impact international law as a whole and can affect the work of pro-life activists on the ground. One of the things that I've found the most interesting about the Trump administration is that they fight on the abortion issue at the United Nations like no previous presidential administration. And I will be honest when I say that the extent to which the Trump administration is willing to go to bat for the pro-life cause at the international level has flat out stunned me. They've actually indicated their willingness to veto international agreements over language that seem to endorse abortion as healthcare, to give you one example. And so in order to have a discussion about what's going on and to understand it better, I asked Austin Ruse to come onto the show and give us a bit of an idea of what's going on. Austin Ruse is the only guy to talk to if you want to know what's going on in regards to the pro-life and pro-family issues at the United Nations. He is head of the Center for Family and Human Rights, or CFAM, since shortly after its creation in 1997, and he's been the president of that organization since the year 2000. Just to give you a few other details on his background, he was the founder, of the National Catholic Prayer Breakfast. He's appeared on any number of cable network programs discussing the United Nations and what goes on there, from CNN, CBS, MSNBC, and Fox News. So that would be the big four. He also has served on a number of various boards, including Catholic Action for Faith and Family, the Veritas Center for Ethics in Public Life, and he's published a number of books, including Fake Science, Exposing the Left's Skewed Statistics, Fuzzy Facts, and Dodgy Data, which was published by Regnery Publishing in 2017, and the award-winning A Littlest Suffering Souls, Children Whose Short Lives Point Us to Christ. So nobody knows what's going on at the UN level in regards to abortion and family issues like Austin Ruse, and he graciously agreed to come on the show and give us an idea of what's going on. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. All right, so my first question is, how did you end up involved in the pro-life movement?
Well, I'll tell you, I was in magazine publishing for many years. I worked at Fortune, Forbes, The Atlantic Monthly, Rolling Stone. I helped launch a magazine at Random House, helped launch a magazine at the Discovery Channel. And I had a religious and a political conversion along the line, and decided I didn't want to do that work anymore. And I up and quit and began volunteering my time with a Catholic priest in New York named John Perricone, and helped run an apostolate that he had out of St. Agnes Church, and just kind of waited for the main chance to find something that would combine my interest in religion and politics. And one day met a young lady from Canada, whose organization, which was Human Life International Canada, which doesn't exist anymore, and they had raised a bunch of money to open up, she said, a pro-life lobbying group at the UN. And this was kind of very much, answered prayers. My interest in politics is mostly in international affairs. One of the books that greatly influenced my conversion to conservative politics was Daniel Patrick Moynihan's book called The World is a Dangerous Place, about his time as U.S. ambassador to the Economic and Social Council at the UN. And so when she said this, my joke is that I literally heard bells ringing and told her that job was mine. and 6 weeks later, it was. And so that's how I got involved. It was strictly through my interest in politics and religion and the United Nations.
So when did you, because I've read quite a bit of your writing about abortion, and you write about it very strongly and very passionately, and presumably at one point prior to your religious conversion, you would have been pro-choice, or were you always instinctively pro-life and you never really had to reconcile yourself on that specific issue?
You know, it was not an issue that I cared deeply about. I never felt compelled to take a position for or against. I think that I recall being grateful that it existed because of immoral ways back in those days. But I never took a political stance. I mean, it was funny because the crowd that I ran with in Washington D.C. in those days were people who were running NARAL. But again, I think I have always been instinctively conservative on political issues, even when I was a Democrat.
So when you launched into this new job lobbying at the United Nations, this would obviously be a pretty steep learning curve. I know a lot of people who have been in the pro-life movement for decades, and you would know exactly what I'm talking about, who really know what's going on politically on the ground in their own countries, but actually have no idea what's going on the international level, have no idea how many decisions are being made that we aren't influencing or even noticing that will actually impact the sort of work that pro-life activists do on the state level or in Canada on the provincial or federal level. So when you first arrived at this position, how did you go about developing a plan for pro-life forces to influence the United Nations on these decisions, especially when a lot of the forces at play seem to sort of, a layperson like myself to be almost impervious to outside influence?
Well, I'll tell you, I didn't create the UN pro-life movement. Honestly, John Paul II did when he made a call for people of faith to join him at Cairo in 1994 at the Conference on Population Development. And so there were people, including the people who founded CFAM. I did not found CFAM. I was hired by them. Who went to Cairo. And so there were an awful lot of people involved in the UN pro-life movement prior to my arrival. I mean, yeah, sure. CFAM was the first, full-time office, working exclusively on these issues at the UN. But that doesn't mean that other people weren't already involved. And so the groundwork was really well advanced. We don't do really anything different today than those, everyday amateurs did at Cairo in 1994 and then Beijing in 95. So it's just reading the document. Yeah, but having said that, I will also say that the learning curve is really straight up, and we certainly know much more now than we did then. I mean, in the early days, we covered the preparatory committee meetings of the big conferences, and then we covered the big conferences. But I don't think that anybody in the UN pro-life movement at that time knew that there were 6 general committees of the General Assembly, and that our work was handled in the 3rd committee. Or I don't think anybody covered all of the commissions that happened from the first of the year through the spring. So while the basics of what we do was established a long time ago, our understanding has really deepened. And with regard to my own organization, I've been doing this now for 22 years. Our research director has been doing it for 12 years. Our head legal guy has been doing it 8 years. Assistant research director has been doing it for 8 years. So we have at CFAM built up a remarkable body of expertise and knowledge over the years. But it's still pretty much what folks did at the Cairo conference. You get the document, you read the document, you identify bad language, you talk to delegations to try and get bad language out, you try to get good language in. That's pretty much what we do today.
What was the first major challenge you faced when you arrived at the United Nations?
Well, that's a good question. I would have to say that the general feeling that we were greatly disliked and even hated, and that they didn't want us there, and that they would fight to keep us out. This was it's pretty much the same situation now, but we're so firmly ensconced. We've all got UN accreditation, so there's not a lot they can do to us. Although they keep trying. As a matter of fact, there's something going on right now which I'd be happy to tell you about. But yeah, that was the thing that was the most challenging in the beginning. Was the real feeling that we were on enemy territory, they didn't want us there, and that they would do almost anything to keep us out.
For your average rank-and-file pro-lifer, who is, of course, very focused on the local, which is an extremely conservative thing to do in regards to the fight against abortion, when you arrived at the United Nations and the experience you've had in the 2 decades since then, what are some things that happen at the United Nations that affect pro-lifers on the local level? And what are some things that happen at the UN that, your average person should just be aware of? Because most people see the United Nations as something that deals with foreign policy differences, but very few people actually think about the UN in relation to abortion, even those who work full-time to fight abortion.
Well, the key thing to understand is that the U.S., along with a few other countries, have the most radical, extreme abortion laws in the whole world. So the U.S., in terms of the law and abortion, is well ahead, exponentially ahead of where the UN is. People may be surprised, if there was a straight up or down vote in the UN on abortion as a human right, it would lose. This is why they use, these synonyms like reproductive health and reproductive rights,
right? Because
they know that they would lose an up or down vote. So folks ought to understand that. Secondly, the threat at the UN and because of UN documents is what a lot of people don't know about, and that's the argument of the other side that the repetitious use of certain phrases like reproductive health have created what's known as customary international law, such that and customary international law is law that hasn't been written down, but all the nations accept it because they believe that it's a part of law, that all the nations act in the same way with regard to this particular issue, and therefore it doesn't need to be written down. And so the argument of the other side is the repetitious use of certain phrases like reproductive health have created a customary international right to abortion. And they have said this. If they say if Roe v. Wade is ever struck down, abortion is still the law of the United States because it's the law of the world. And they do say this, and courts around the world do agree with that. And what folks ought to understand is that at least within recent memory, our Supreme Court has cited UN documents that we've never ratified. When the Supreme Court overturned the juvenile death penalty now many years ago, the majority cited, first of all, foreign law, and second of all, cited a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the U.S. has never ratified. The Supreme Court cited the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is one of the implementing documents of the international the Human Rights Declaration.
Yeah.
So they cited this International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a hard law document, but they cited a part of it that our Senate formally rejected when we ratified the treaty, that is to say, on the death penalty. So the Supreme Court, certain members of it, have been more than willing to cite UN documents that we're not a party to interpret our own Constitution. So I am firmly convinced that if Roe v. Wade is ever reheard in the Supreme Court, UN documents will be cited either by the majority upholding Roe or by the minority when Roe is overturned. So that's one of the reasons that we as American pro-lifers are involved. We're also involved because UN documents have a real impact on countries around the world. So there's a domestic reason to be involved, and there's an international reason to be involved.
So when you look back at your 2 decades working on the international level, and the first few years, what were some of the issues that you faced, some of the more difficult ones, and a few of the early key victories that gave you a lot of encouragement when you were embarking on what's now been almost a quarter of a century?
Well, the debates that, it's kind of funny. I say that the debates that we have today at the UN are identical to the debates that took place at the Cairo Conference in 1994. It is the attempt to insert the phrase reproductive health and/or reproductive rights and/or sexual rights into UN documents, binding and non-binding. And that debate at Cairo and then at Beijing and then at the Rio Environmental Conference and on and on and on through dozens and dozens of conferences is precisely the debate that we had last week in the Security Council when the Trump administration threatened a veto of a resolution on rape in times of war because it included a reference to reproductive health, which the Trump administration properly understands is synonymous with abortion. So, it's funny. It's tedious. We have the same debates today that we had at the Cairo Conference in 1994. Now, the interesting thing over the years is that we have been very successful in making sure that reproductive health comes out as many documents as possible, or that it is defined as excluding abortion. So this has really been the territory that we've been debating on. At the one of the great victories was the International Criminal Court negotiation many years ago that called the Rome Statutes of the International Criminal Court, and the battle there was a phrase that they wanted to use called forced pregnancy, and this was one of their backdoor ways of being able to say that people who oppose abortion are in fact international criminals. And so what we did with a number of member states is we ensured that forced pregnancy was defined to exclude abortion. As a matter of fact, it was a great victory. Forced pregnancy is defined in the International Criminal Court as the repeated rape of a woman during wartime, her deliberate confinement in order to change the ethnic composition of the country. The other side was quite annoyed by that, but they've never come back to try to insert forced pregnancy into a document. Although they're revisiting that now with a new treaty on crimes against humanity, so it'll come up again. So that was a great victory. Another great victory was, in fact, we gave an award to the president of Costa Rica many years ago because the French and the Germans tried to initiate a political declaration that would make a distinction between reproductive cloning and so-called therapeutic cloning. And so we were able to knock this down. And as you know, they say therapeutic cloning is the deliberate creation of a human being, of a human clone. But then that would be acceptable as long as the clone was destroyed in research. And that they were for that, but that they were against so-called reproductive cloning, which would create, which would allow a cloned human being to grow to childhood, adulthood, so on and so forth. So working with the president of Costa Rica and others, we were able to knock that down completely. So along the way, there have been great victories. For instance, we've got great definitions of gender in UN documents. Again, at the International Criminal Court negotiations, we were able to get a definition of gender, which is men and women in the context of society. In the Beijing document, gender is to be understood as it has been traditionally understood. So in all the gender craziness that we see around the world and in the United States, the UN actually has two pretty good definitions of gender. So there have been great victories over the years.
There isn't a pro-life activist that I know that hasn't had some utterly surreal experiences in their work as a pro-life activist. What you do is different than what most pro-life activists do, but what would be some of your more surreal moments in the work that you're doing?
Surreal. That's an interesting way of putting things. Gosh, I don't know. What do you mean by surreal?
Surreal is sort of this moment where you can't believe that you're doing what you're doing, that you're talking to the person that you're talking to. So for a lot of people, it's these just bizarre conversations with abortionists. I think one of the moments that sticks out the most for me is when I held a baby that had been pulled out of a dumpster in my hands That was very high up there. So it runs the whole range of things, but there are things that you expect when you join the pro-life movement, and then there are the things that just happen to you that you never expected. And virtually everybody has.
It's interesting because, I almost feel like we do our work at 35,000 feet.
Right.
We're not on the ground. We don't do, crisis pregnancy centers, or we're never at abortion clinics. We're negotiating documents of an either hard law or soft law definition. So it's funny because I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. We mostly, what we do at the UN is we search for people who will support us. We rarely try to convince the other side because it's almost a waste of time at the UN. We don't have to have a majority at the UN to win. All we need is enough to block consensus. So we don't have to spend a lot of time trying to convince those on the other side. So I don't know that I've ever had a surreal experience as you describe.
When you're looking at the last couple of decades, one of the things that I've often been interested in is, I get your newsletter, and you've referred quite often the last year, a little bit longer than that, to Trump administration officials at the UN actually doing the hard work of blocking resolutions, even popular resolutions, because of language that would safeguard abortion that is put in those resolutions. But you would have been at the UN as well during the Bush administration, and George W. Bush himself was very pro-life. But I get the feeling doing a lot of this reading, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would prefer to be wrong on this actually, that you have what's sort of colloquially referred to as the deep state, which means that regardless of who the administration is, there's this sort of army of bureaucrats that pursue their own agenda, irrespective of the views of the man in the Oval Office. Is there a difference between the United Nations and those that were representing U.S. policy during the Bush years as there is during the Trump years?
Well, there were a lot of good people in the Bush administration working on UN issues, but there's no comparison between the commitment of the Bush administration and what the Trump administration has been willing to do. It is quite remarkable. And that, and I don't know what accounts for it. One of the problems during the Bush administration was the Iraq War. And so a lot of the Muslim countries that would have naturally stood with us on some of the life issues would not stand with the Bush administration, even when they agreed. So the Bush administration found itself very much isolated when they tried to advance certain pro-life issues. The Trump administration has not run into that problem. But I'll tell you, the Trump administration, and we say this domestically, but we also say it internationally, has been the most pro-life administration in our history. The Trump administration, last week threatened a veto over reproductive health in the Security Council. The Bush administration would not even have considered that. They wouldn't even have thought of that. This administration has a written policy that their negotiators are supposed to, eliminate reproductive health from documents. Failing that, they're supposed to qualify it with what we call the Cairo caveats, and they're good caveats. And there was nothing like that in the Bush administration. So there is that. And there are, and it hasn't been easy with the Trump administration. There have been people in the administration who are not with us on these issues, and they've worked against what we have been trying to do. And then you look at somebody like Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley has a reputation of being very pro-life. She didn't do anything for the pro-life cause at the UN. Nothing, nada. That is not to say that the Trump administration didn't, but certainly not with her help. I'm convinced that she went to the UN to burnish her foreign policy credentials. Therefore, she was tough with regard to the protection of Israel and tough in Iran and things like that. And that's why I think she wanted to go there, was to burnish her hardcore foreign policy credentials. But I suspect that she felt that her pro-life bona fides were solid enough that she didn't have to do anything for the pro-life cause at the UN, and she didn't. So, there's a whole lot of reasons why the Trump administration has been better. on the pro-life issue. I mean, I'm convinced overall that it's been better on the pro-life issue because at the end of the day, the president first of all, did not feel strongly one way or the other on the issue, and therefore he was willing to do the bidding of those who fought for him, which included pro-lifers, and that he didn't care about the approval of the elites, and therefore he was more than willing to take a very strong pro-life stance. Human respect, it can be poisoned, exponentially so in a politician. And so I think that even good conservatives want the approval of the cocktail party circuit at the UN and in Washington, D.C., and therefore have not been willing to take as strong a stand as you and I would take. This does not seem to be the case with the Trump administration.
Well, it's interesting. I have a few questions related to this topic, and these questions are segueing right into the topics that I wanted to talk about anyways. I went to the Trump inauguration with somebody from the Susan B. Anthony list, and then the next day I went to the Women's March just because I was interested to see what this was all going to be about, and I was there to report on it as well. So I was at this Women's March, and it was packed. It was probably bigger than the inauguration. I've never been at such a big event in my life. It was just enormous, and I was there with another pro-lifer. And I know that the pro-lifers were saying, like, this is kind of scary, right? There's hundreds of thousands of people out in the streets of D.C., but I was looking at them scream at the White House, F you, Trump, hoisting these signs. Yeah. The person running the main stage was Cecile Richards. And I remember thinking the pro-life movement just won Trump without having to say a word, because the only thing this guy knows how to do when somebody shoves him is to shove back twice as hard. And when Cecile Richards got on the stage in front of a massive mob, and I was there, I read the signs. They called Trump every name in the book. They complained about his crudeness. How are we going to explain Trump to the children? But the Women's March was full of children, and I've never read such graphic and pornographic signs in my life. And I've been doing this for a while. And basically, they ensured that Ivanka or Jared or the rest of them that are more, part of the pro-choice liberals New York set, that there was no way that they were going to be able to broker a deal between Planned Parenthood and the Trump administration, because the abortion industry preemptively declared war on Trump the day after he got inaugurated, and that's one of the things that put him on our side. One of the things I found interesting is I've read the books that have come out of the administration so far as well, and Bob Woodward quotes Steve Bannon as pushing Trump on his abortion record when he first discussed running, and that Trump was like, what has my position on this been? Like, he didn't really care about the issue. And so and maybe you can't tell us this, but I'm curious, when you look at Trump's administration, who do you think is such a driving force for the pro-life cause in that administration? Because like George W. Bush was a very personally pro-life person. His description of why he was pro-life made it into his memoirs post-presidency. Trump was always sort of, kind of squishy on the issue, yet his administration is willing to do unpopular things, hardline things, and stick to the pro-life script all the way through. Who in his administration do you think is the driving force behind that?
Well, I think that there probably isn't just one driving force. He's got people around him who are very pro-life. Leonard Leo, for instance, who has been advising on judges from the very beginning and helped develop the initial judges list. Kellyanne Conway, true blue, 100%, movement pro-lifer. There's a woman that nobody's heard of named Katie Talento, who is in charge of healthcare and the Domestic Policy Council, who is a movement pro-lifer. John Bremberger, who was the head of the Domestic Policy Council, Steubenville grad, Ave Maria Law School grad, movement pro-lifer. He's had the wisdom to appoint people all over the administration who are movement pro-lifers. There's a guy nobody's ever heard of except a few. I mean, he's got a huge job. He's deputy secretary number 2 at Health and Human Services, Eric Hargan, movement pro-lifer. What's his name? Roger Severino at HHS, just movement pro-lifer. Valerie Huber, movement pro-lifer. You look all over HHS and in certain places at USAID and even certain places in state. He has appointed people who are movement pro-lifers, not people who simply say, I'm pro-life, which a lot of people say, but people who have really expended their lives in the pro-life movement. So, whenever an issue comes up, there are generally very pro-life people, movement pro-lifers, who are right there, ready to give him the right words, give him the right policy. So I would say that there's not a single driver. I'd say that there are dozens of drivers.
What's the most encouraging thing that you've seen about what the Trump administration is doing? Because there are people who say if Trump only gets one term, then perhaps the pro-life movement's association with him will do them damage. But you're looking at policies that are being enacted at an international level that have a long-standing effect. So from your perspective, what has the Trump administration done on an international level that will assist the pro-life cause for years to come?
Well, he defunded UNFPA, which to me is not that important of a thing.
Right.
It wasn't a lot of money that UNFPA got. They generally go to the Europeans and have it immediately replaced, and then some. Mexico City policy, I think, is very important. The fact that he expanded Mexico City policy to include the entire global health budget, is exponentially important. All of these will be turned back on the first day of the next Democrat administration. That's one of the problems with international issues, is that it is generally within the purview of the executive branch. But rolling back language on reproductive health, I think, will have a lasting impact. Caveating reproductive health, and I'll just talk briefly about the Cairo caveats.
Yeah.
Our opponents lost a lot at Cairo. Cairo says that abortion is a matter of national policy and not of multilateral, organizations. It says it put abortion in a bad and negative light. So the Cairo caveats are very, very important. And the fact that the Trump administration is foursquare in favor of removing reproductive health from documents and then putting the Cairo caveats can have a lasting effect on the debate. This debate's going to go on, on and on and on and on and on. But what the Trump administration has done is to rally, I think, upwards of 60 countries who now know that they can stand up to the European Union, the UN agencies, and that probably will have a lasting effect.
What are the half dozen, most pro-abortion countries and most pro-abortion drivers of pro-abortion language at the UN right now?
Well, the individual states of the European Union, the United Kingdom, Germany, France, the Nordic countries, most especially, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden. They also tend to be the donor countries who are therefore able to push their agenda really hard. Canada is bad. Those are the leading countries, but there are other countries that follow, many in Latin America. We've lost South America. We used to have very strong delegations coming from South America, and we don't really anymore. Argentina used to be strong years ago. Mexico has never been good, even when there's been a quote conservative in the executive office in Mexico. But yeah, the leaders are countries of the European Union or of the Council of Europe.
What right now would be the most pro-life countries that you look to when you're there? The ones that sort of balance out the ones you just mentioned.
The most what? You faded out a little bit.
Are the most pro-life countries, the ones that sort of balance out the ones you just mentioned?
Well, the Holy See is very strong. The African countries are not all of them, but enough of them are very, very strong. Of course, the United States. There will be individual countries of Latin America who sometimes will step forward. The Caribbean countries can step forward. The Muslim countries can be very strong, though they're not, pro-life in the way that we necessarily are. So, yeah, you can't point to any particular country because we always have to cobble together a coalition of countries to stand with us. Russia has been on and off for years, and when they're on, they're very powerful. So yeah, it depends upon the negotiation. It depends upon who's in the negotiating chair. But generally, we're able to put together a large enough coalition of member states to fight back to make it a victory for us, or at least competitive.
So when you look at countries like Argentina, Mexico, as you know, a lot of the South American countries right now are sort of caught in these massive battles over abortion. We hung on to Argentina by, I believe, 3 votes last year. Would you say, looking at the delegations that are heading towards the UN, that a change in law in those countries is inevitable? Or would you say that the pro-life majorities, even though they're narrower than they used to be in those countries, still have the ability to hold this off?
I cannot speak to the domestic pro-life policies in other countries, because that's really not what we do. I don't know the state of the pro-life movement in Argentina or Chile or Peru. What we know are the delegations that they send to the United Nations. One of the sad things that happens at the UN is that, countries that will have, where abortion is illegal, for instance, they will send bad delegations to the UN. And they do that as kind of as a pressure valve, that they will send radical feminists on their UN delegation to kind of throw them a bone. And so you'll have 100% pro-life countries with delegations at the UN negotiating in favor of abortion. That happens quite a bit. But yeah, I can't speak to, it's hard enough to know what's going on at the UN without knowing, the domestic pro-life politics around the world. So yeah, I can't answer that question.
What were some of the most damaging things that took place during Obama's 8-year tenure at the UN?
Well, I mean, they pushed really hard, of course, on spreading reproductive health and reproductive rights and abortion. They pushed really hard in pushing sexual orientation and gender identity, which is a highly problematic issue at the UN. One, by the way, that hasn't gained much traction because most of the delegations at the United Nations are against that as a legal category. But I would say that the Obama administration was more radical than the Clinton administration.
So one of the things I've found interesting about the UN is recently I read Obi Anuji-Ikoka's book, Target Africa, where she talks about how countries, you referred to earlier to the Nordic countries as donor countries, and how these countries will essentially use that financial leverage to pressure them on other issues. And there was one anecdote in her book where she said this African ambassador walked past saying it's just all about sex for these guys. Is that tension obvious at the UN, where you have nations that are so busy working on existential struggles on the development of their countries and just can't understand why the only thing that a lot of the Western countries seem to want to talk about are like pelvic issues?
Well, I actually call them the pelvic left. And we've been talking about, ideological colonialism since long before the Pope mentioned it at the UN. We're very grateful that Pope Francis did. I think I know the priest who put that in his speech. And the African bishops have met on this particular issue many times about the pelvic left from Europe trying to impose their view in the name of human rights on African countries. There is very little question that Africa is a real battlefield in the global culture wars. The pelvic left wants to impose their view on every man, woman, and child all over the globe. And I got to give them their due. I mean, they think that this is the right thing to do. That people will not be free until they are quote unquote sexually free, and that the two institutions that stand in the way of this freedom are the family and the church, and therefore they must be done away with. I mean, I absolutely believe that they believe this, and that's really what we're up against. We consistently see very poor African countries willing to stand up to the Europeans at the United Nations, and they have a lot to lose. They have money to lose, primarily, yet time and time again they're willing to do it. I mean, the Africans are really quite amazing. I think that Africa will save Western civilization But first, we must save Africa.
When you're looking at the current situation under the Trump administration, I guess you said that the work you're doing now is the same as the work you did 22 years ago. It's all about trying to get rid of pro-abortion language and insert pro-life language. But to somebody, if you had to give an encapsulation to somebody who's listening right now and wants to know the answer to basically two questions. What's your most optimistic view of what's going on the international level? And then secondarily, what's your most pessimistic view? Because a lot of people listening will have never actually considered pro-life work on the international level. So that will give them a balanced view of what's going on.
You say my most optimistic view at the international level?
Yes.
Well, I think that on the question of abortion, the optimistic view is we will continue to block an international right to abortion. That they will never get an international right to abortion through UN documents. My pessimistic view is that won't really matter because domestic judges around the country, around the world, are saying that there's an international right to abortion. And why are they saying this? They're saying this because UN bureaucrats, including the Secretary General, say that there is, even though there's not. So the other side continues to lie around the world. And so optimistically, I think that with regard to the documents, we'll continue to win. And pessimistically, we are facing many challenges around the world on the ground because of what people say about UN documents.
One of the things, and this is a much broader question, but I'd be interested to hear your take on this, is do you think there's at any point going to be somewhat of a power shift in the dynamic between the countries who haven't replaced their population in years, right? BBC just came out with a report this month noting the fact that there are now more grandparents in the world than there are children. And at some point, the nations that are reproducing their populations that do have an excellent birth rate are far more likely to actually, have sustainable populations. Do you think that at some point we're going to see a power shift between the nations with dying birth rates and those with booming birth rates?
Well, there are really no countries with booming birth rates. That's part of the problem. I mean, the population controllers have largely won. It's like every country in the world is below replacement except a few in Africa. So I don't know that there will be any kind of a power shift because of fertility reduction. I mean that's a good question. The UN. It's funny. Gosh, 20 years ago, the UN had an expert group meeting on population, on fertility decline. And the question before the experts, and I'll never forget this, was how low can fertility go? And the consensus of those in the room, and it was a fairly small meeting of population experts, was they did not know how low it would go. So the UN has known for a very long time that fertility reduction is on a downward slide, and they don't know how low it's going to go. Japan became the first country in the world, and this was 20 years ago, to have more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 15. And now that's common. So the experts don't know what to do. Russia has worked very hard to get their fertility rate up, and they've achieved it. France has worked very hard to get theirs up, and they've achieved it. I don't think they're above replacement. Hungary is trying very hard to get theirs up. The answer, as far as I'm concerned, the answer is not a governmental solution. It's a spiritual solution, because you have to somehow work to get greed out of the human heart. Now, of course, that's a really hard thing to do. But,
right.
But I think, one of the reasons that people are not having, very many children is because, at least in the West, they want the beach house, they want the European vacation and things like that. Why is this happening around the world? I think it's because they have convinced African women and Asian women that it's the smart sort of European thing to do is to have very few children, and they bought into the idea that children are a burden. How do you turn that around? I think faith is one of the things that will turn this around, but ultimately I don't know. Will government programs turn it around? There's limited success for that. We are heading into what Donald Rumsfeld referred to as unknown unknowns.
As a final question, just for the people who often think the UN is this sort of nefarious, shady organization pulling the strings of the world while the rest of us go on in ignorance. And I'd like to demystify that for a moment. What you're describing is actually just a group of people that are getting together and fighting about what goes into a variety of documents. So just as a final question, could you just let our listeners know what it's like at the UN, what your analysis is, and then finally tell everybody where they can find your work and where they can follow your work.
My friend Jean Head, who was a longtime lobbyist for national right to life at the UN, she lives in New York, always said that she felt the presence of evil when she would walk into the UN, and you could certainly feel that. What people don't know is that we have many, many friends at the UN who need our help. People on foreign delegations to the UN, even people in the UN bureaucracy, will occasionally reach out to us to ask for help or to offer us encouragement. So the quite remarkable thing is that we have so many friends at the United Nations, and it's not completely enemy territory. Partially, particularly with regard to the UN bureaucracy, but not completely. And so that's what you experience when you go to the UN. It is also quite a remarkable experience to go to the UN, to sit down and talk to UN delegates, from foreign countries who are so happy to have your support, so happy that you're there, and who feel overwhelmed themselves. These people come from poor countries, and they've got small delegations, and they'll come to the UN, and they don't know anything, and they don't know anybody. And here's a bunch of Christian, lobbyists working to help them. I once told the Sudanese ambassador that this was heading into a midnight negotiation. I said, when things get really tough tonight, right over there will be 20 Christians praying for you. And this was the Sudanese ambassador from a country that persecutes Christians. And he was a lion that night in defending the unborn child and fighting against the Europeans. So it is a quite a remarkable experience all these years to spend at the UN. People ask me, when I'm out and about, giving talks around the country, what can I do? And what I always tell them, and that's what I'll tell your listeners now, is stay home and take over the school board. If you feel called to come to the UN, by all means come. But for the most part, we need people taking over the school boards.
Final question, and where can people find your work so they can follow what you're doing?
c-fam.org, c-fam.org. People can subscribe to the Friday Fax, which is, now 22 years old. It's the only weekly source of UN stories coming out of UN headquarters on life and family matters. Written as straight journalism, 2 500-word stories every week. We haven't missed a week in 22 years, except during 9/11. It's quite a remarkable source of what's really going on at the UN, plus lots of other research reports and things like that. So there's a lot on our website for people who are interested in this issue.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with CFAM President Austin Ruse, who runs the Center for Family and Human Rights, on what's going on at the United Nations and what every pro-life person should know and be aware of about what's happening at the international level. If you found this conversation interesting and you want to hear other conversations like it, please head over to LifeSiteNews.com for more episodes of The Van Maren Show. And while you're there, you can read a wide range of both opinion commentary and cutting-edge news on pro-life and pro-family issues. Thanks so much for joining us this week. And again, we hope you'll join us again next week.